Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Jordan Newton, a research associate here at the Citizens Research Council of Michigan. I'd like to welcome you to the webinar today, where we will be discussing our recently released report on regional transportation in Michigan. Our report examines how regional transit is governed in Michigan, shortfalls in the current system, and looks to other urban areas across the country to learn from their experiences. Our report, along with a shorter summary, can be found on our webpage at www.crcmich.org. Before getting to the webinar material, let me introduce our organization. The Citizens Research Council of Michigan is a statewide, nonpartisan public affairs research group. We are celebrating our 103rd birthday this year. A longevity we attribute to our promotion of informed public policy for state and local governments through the provision of accurate, independent, and objective research. I also want to remind you that we are a private, not-for-profit entity. As such, we rely on the charitable contributions of foundations, businesses, and corporations. I'd like to encourage all of you to join our circle of supporters and help us to continue to provide high-quality, independent information on important policy topics in Michigan. You can learn more about the Research Council at www.crcmich.org. At the right of our website, you'll find an opportunity to sign up for our email distribution list to be notified about newly released papers. Jill Roof is our presenter today. Jill serves as a research associate, focusing primarily on local government issues in Michigan. Jill earned her bachelor's in political science from Grand Valley State and her master's in public administration from Wayne State. Please note, we are recording this webinar and we will post it on our webpage where it will be available for future viewing. Second, we have everyone but the presenters on mute, so we will not be able to hear you speak. To ask a question, please type the question into the questions pane that should be appearing on your screen. You can type these questions in at any time. If you have any technical problems during today's webinar, please let us know by calling 517-485-9444. After the webinar, you will receive an email soliciting your feedback, and we would very much appreciate any feedback that you have. With that, I'll turn things over to Jill.
Good morning. As Jordan said, my name is Jill Roof, and I am happy to be here this morning talking to you about our recent report titled Rethinking Regional Transportation in Michigan's Urban Areas. We begin our discussion of public transportation talking about what is transportation and how can different kinds of transportation, public, private, different modes and types, work together to improve mobility. Traditional public transportation includes things like bus and rail systems, mainly bus in Michigan, and these traditional modes are coexisting with emerging transportation options, including ride-sharing, car-sharing, bike and scooter rentals, microtransit, which is small-scale transit options with flexible routing and scheduling, and autonomous vehicles. Moving forward, the focus needs to be on how to provide seamless public transportation options that coordinate with private options and improve mobility for all residents of urban areas. So the question we asked when we started this research is, why is public transportation important? It is important because it affects us all, whether we ride the bus or not. If we don't have it, we're affected by not having that option. The absence of good public transit creates opportunity costs by forcing people to spend their disposable income on cars and driving. Transit is not just for the low income and those without other options. Road funding is important, but it is not our only transportation need. Transit is important to business, necessary to urban revitalization, and can contribute to economic development in our urban areas. Improved mobility requires 1, a focus on regional transportation because mobility needs cross local government boundaries, and 2, an ability to do things differently as transit service needs to incorporate and accommodate emerging services and evolving transportation options. The primary goal of public transportation policy is to improve mobility and access to transportation for all people. However, public transportation policy affects and is affected by numerous policy concerns beyond mobility and access, such as those listed here. No transit provider or local government has authority over all public policy issues affecting transit, which is a big reason why we need collaboration in providing regional transportation. After discussing why public transportation is important in our paper, we make the case for why we need improved regional transportation options. For one, the benefits of transportation are numerous and include pollution and congestion reduction, enhanced mobility, and public health benefits, among others. In fact, access to transportation is a social determinant of health. Improved regional transportation is also needed because of some very real and growing barriers to driving and mobility. For one, car ownership is expensive all around. The costs of buying, maintaining, running, putting gas in cars, but the cost of car insurance can price out even middle-income people in Michigan's urban areas. This is a huge issue in urban areas of the state where you have poverty rates near 40% in Detroit and Flint. Michigan has the highest annual car insurance premiums with an average of almost $2,700 a year compared to a national average of under $1,500. Detroit is the highest cost city with rates averaging over $5,400. With a median household income of under $28,000 in Detroit in 2017, car insurance costs average almost 20% of the median household income. According to the U.S. Treasury Department's Federal Insurance Office, car insurance is considered unaffordable in a community if it averages more than 2% of median household income. Another barrier to driving in Michigan is Michigan's aging population, which has a greater need for transportation services as old age requires some to give up or reduce driving. Also, commuting flows in southeast Michigan among Wayne, Oakland, and Macomb counties are high. This is because jobs are not concentrated in the urban center, but dispersed throughout the region. A recent study ranked Detroit in the top 10% for traffic congestion out of 240 cities, estimating that commuters spend up to 33 hours per year in traffic. It is not as high in Ann Arbor and Grand Rapids and some other urban areas, but congestion is still remains high and growing. Now that we've made the case for effective regional transportation systems, we need to define what the term means. It includes a broad focus on mobility management and multimodal transportation that integrates all different kinds of public and private transportation options across political boundaries. It must be dynamic and responsive to changes in transportation and ridership. It requires 1, a change in the perception of what public transportation is, 2, regional governance, and 3, regional funding mechanisms. The key word is regional. Cities, even major urban destinations, cannot go it alone and need the support of the region. So the first requirement to improve regional transportation in Michigan's urban areas is changing the perception of public transportation. Public transportation is much less prevalent in the U.S. than in other countries, and providing a system that can attract all kinds of riders has been a problem. Why is this? Some have pointed to urban sprawl in the U.S. or our car-dominant history, but one issue may be with our mindset. Other countries view public transit as a vital public utility, while in the U.S. we tend to view it as a social welfare program. This mentality has led to heavily subsidized services, but prevents charging sufficient fares or funding at sufficient levels to provide efficient services, which limits its ability to attract riders with other transportation options. Viewing public transportation as a social welfare program can also make it a more highly scrutinized political issue. Transit should be thought of as an investment in our regional economy, not an act of charity. To provide effective regional transportation in Michigan's urban areas, public transportation needs to be viewed as an important and viable transportation option that contributes to the revitalization of urban areas. The focus needs to be on improving mobility through partnerships with the private sector and evolving transportation options. One new-ish concept is mobility as a service, which is a combination of public and private transportation options that provide holistic, optimal, people-centered options that enable seamless end-to-end journeys paid for by the user as a single charge. This can involve the increased use of mobility managers and microtransit, which is flexible, inexpensive, on-demand, door-to-door service. The focus is on mobility and individual transportation needs rather than large-scale bus or rail service. There is also a growing body of research that shows that ride-sharing can be used differently than public transit and as a complement to it. Some sources have found evidence linking ride-sharing to increased congestion and decreased transit ridership, but we are in fairly new territory here, and we do not know yet how they will coexist. Partnerships between ride-sharing and public transit appear to be on the rise. Autonomous vehicles represent a very new emerging category of transportation as well. It remains to be seen what will happen in the future, but an ideal scenario would employ them to serve the needs of many, providing first and last mile service and connecting people to transit. We also looked at transit-oriented development. In Michigan, transit is often viewed as a social service, and its part in contributing to economic development and urban revitalization is overlooked. Vibrant communities use transit-oriented development to leverage improved mobility and transportation options to promote economic development throughout the region. The second requirement to improve transportation in Michigan's urban areas is regional governance. Regional governance can be a voluntary collaboration among local units and transit providers, or state-mandated regional governance systems. In the current governance system, the fact that every level of government has a role in public transportation can create confusion, lead to differing goals, and slow the process. The federal role is one of mainly oversight, guidance, and funding, mainly capital. The state provides authority for local units to provide transportation services and to create transit agencies, as well as providing oversight and distributing state and federal funds for public transit. Public transportation services are all provided locally or regionally. In our report, we looked at public transportation in 5 regions in Michigan, discussing how it is provided, governed, and funded. Each of these regions is a transportation management area for federal transportation planning purposes with population above 200,000 people. All of the transportation providers in these regions are governed under 4 state authorizing acts related to transportation. This is because, as stated, local government and transportation authorities are creatures of the state. In our paper, we discuss these authorizing acts and whether they are adequate to provide public transportation service, which we admit is a subjective term. Through reviewing the state laws, we found that they tend to favor local rather than regional control by allowing for voluntary participation and providing some governance protections for the local units that are in the transit authority regions. We also found that they provide transit authorities with governance over public transportation, but no role in other public policy issues that can enhance or derail the effectiveness of transit, such as land use and planning or zoning policies. We found that they don't explicitly address collaboration among transit providers and local units of government within a region, even though collaboration and cooperation is critical to the success of public transportation. This map highlights the voluntary nature of transit authorities, showing transit deserts in white and how transit service can be concentrated in urban areas. The purple area shows where the RIDE provides service in the Ann Arbor area. The light blue and gray shows where the Detroit Department of Transportation provides service. It probably overstates service a bit. It shows transit service into Livonia, for example, and other areas where DDOT only provides a bus line into the community, but not necessarily service throughout the community. The dark blue and gray areas show where the Smart Bus provides service. There is some overlap in connections, but no connections between Ann Arbor and Detroit, and too many disconnected areas across Metro Detroit. It is myopic thinking that negatively affects the whole region when individual communities suggest that they are stronger without participating in this vital regional service. Our review of the current system found many shortcomings related to a lack of regional service across political boundaries, rider challenges related to gaps in service or infrequent service, and problems with transfers and multi-operator trips. All these problems can be boiled down to a lack of regional policies. The need for regional policies go beyond explicit transportation policies to include land use and planning, streets and road policies, public safety and security, placemaking, transit-oriented development, economic development, and tax-based sharing. An effective system will put the good of the region above the parochial desires of local units. It requires collaboration as transit providers lack authority over many of these policies. As we've been saying, regional transportation will not be successful without regional policies promoting public transportation. However, specific goals related to transportation can include many things, such as maximizing ridership, covering all parts of a service area, etc. These goals can conflict with each other, and often require trade-offs. In the paper, we discuss some potential policy actions to promote regional transportation. But before we can do that, first we need to decide on our public transportation and mobility goals as a state and as regions. The second step is to align state, local, and regional policies toward these goals. As stated above, public policy options include trade-offs and compromise. For example, a policy to improve the streets for all types of transportation, including cars, transit, biking, walking, etc., can only be implemented at the expense of a policy that solely promotes improving the car and driving experience. Also, transit providers cannot focus all their resources on maximizing ridership and covering all parts of a service area. Compromises have to be made. Goals can conflict or simply compete for funding. In our report, we identify state-level policies that would better promote regional transportation. These include banning opt-outs in state authorizing legislation. Stronger state laws would require urban regions to provide public transportation with no opt-out ability. It is important to remember that participation does not have to be based on county or specific local government, but can be based on factors such as population density, the location of employment centers, retail centers, or other facilities, major road corridors, or income levels. The state could also allow other regions to create regional transit authorities, like in Southeast Michigan, possibly without the governance measures that currently give local governments in the RTA region control over some board activities. The state could strengthen regional influence over authorities by changing the governance structure of the RTA and other transit authorities from boards appointed by local officials to elected boards. This would make them more accountable to residents, but also possibly more partisan and potentially less technically knowledgeable. The one-person, one-vote principle of the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution has long been held to require elected officials for local units of government to be elected from equal-sized population districts. This principle has not been carried over to the representation on boards of regional entities, but it is something to consider. The state could also incentivize regional collaboration through grants and funding opportunities, and allowing new local option taxes related to the provision of regional transportation. The state could mandate that planning and zoning and related policies move to the county level. This would help to provide a more regional focus to these functions, but it would also lessen local control and autonomy. We also identify some local and regional level policy recommendations. First, local units and transit authorities could voluntarily choose to cooperate and integrate land use policies with transportation policies to promote effective regional transportation. They could adopt transit-oriented development, complete streets, and other transit-friendly policies. Local transit authorities need to coordinate with neighboring providers and adopt regional passes and payment options. Regions must determine transportation boundaries and who has authority over what area or type of service in order to promote cooperation. Regional providers may provide express-type service with few stops in between, while local providers fill in with local bus service and lots of stops. Also, we may need to re-examine bus routes and options. Many urban areas have recently redesigned their bus routes after finding that they did not reflect current travel patterns and needs. These maps on this slide show the current and future transit service in the Indianapolis area. Future service represents an expansion in service. The region recently passed an income tax in support of transit. But it also represents a movement away from the spoke and hub model where people had to travel to the center of the city to catch the bus to travel to another part of town. In the future, people will be able to travel north-south and east-west across the city. The third requirement for effective regional transportation systems are regional funding mechanisms. This can be difficult in fractured communities, but it is necessary to connect transportation and mobility across the entire region. Public transit funding can also be complicated by the fact that it competes with so many other policies and programs for funding, especially other transportation programs like road funding. These graphs show the average sources of operating and capital funding for transportation service across the country. They illustrate how important local funding is to public transportation. In our report, we discuss all the current funding sources, but the focus is on local and regional funding. The federal government provides mostly capital funding and generally provides incremental funding to all types of transportation. State constitution specifies that all taxes on motor fuels and vehicle registrations must be used for transportation, and it breaks down to about 90% towards roads and 10% or less towards transit. A portion of the sales tax on motor fuels goes to public transportation as well, but the recent funding increases have mostly gone towards roads. Of the $1.2 billion transportation funding increase passed in 2015, less than 5% will go towards transit. Recent income tax earmarking changes have all gone towards roads. The big source of local funding for public transportation is the property tax. This table shows that all the urban transit providers in Michigan currently levy a property tax. The Detroit Department of Transportation does not levy a property tax, but it is supported by Detroit's general fund, which is supported by property and income taxes, among others. This slide helps to demonstrate why local and regional funding is so important to public transportation. The pie chart shows all transit funding across the U.S. in urban areas with a population over 200,000. Local funding and fares make up almost 60% of all urban transit funding. The table is from the Michigan Department of Transportation's Long-Range Transportation Plan and shows a projected revenue gap in the public transportation program of $10.1 billion over a 25-year period. This is the revenue gap in expected state and federal funds towards public transportation. It represents a gap of $404 million per year and is bigger than the expected state and federal revenue in support of public transportation, which is estimated at $324 million per year. The local property tax is the main source of funding to support public transportation, and we've identified many problems with using the property tax to fund regional transportation services. First, the property tax is used by every kind of local government in Michigan to fund all types of services: schools, public safety, local government administration, the list goes on. Second, property tax revenues have been constrained over the years by property tax limitations that have been passed into law, such as the Headley Amendment of 1978 and Proposal A of 1994, and by the Great Recession, which lowered property values substantially. And with Proposal A, once property values decrease, they can only increase by the rate of inflation until or unless property is sold. Third, the property tax is regressive. Communities with high property values can levy low tax rates to fund services, while communities with low property values must levy higher taxes to fund the same services. This creates a cycle where those that can afford to leave the high tax community do, lowering the property values even more and requiring even higher tax rates to fund services. Also, the property tax is an unsuitable regional tax. It is too connected to a person's home, whereas the benefits of public transportation are regional and not necessarily connected to your house and your specific community, especially for communities further from the urban center. Other types of taxes, income, sales, for example, are not as connected to place and might be a better fit. This table and the table on the next slide highlight the differences in communities and taxable value per capita across communities, which helps to illustrate why the property tax is regressive, why we need other sources of funding for regional transportation, and why tax-based sharing is so important. If we look at Southeast Michigan on this table, the taxable value per capita in Wayne County is about $22,500. The taxable value per capita in Oakland is almost $44,000, almost double. If we look at taxes levied, the average in Wayne County is almost 56 mills, and in Oakland it is 43 mills. The differences are more stark at the local level. The average mills levied by the city of Detroit is 31.5, and the taxable value per capita is under $9,000. The city of Troy levies around 10 mills and has a taxable value per capita of over $55,000, over 5 times that of Detroit. The variances are not as severe in other regions across the state, but they exist. Holland has over twice the taxable value per capita of Muskegon. Delta Township has twice that of Lansing, for example. After reviewing funding for public transportation in Michigan, we looked at how urban regions across the country fund public transportation and found some similarities across the regions. First, we found a heavy reliance on local sales taxes. According to the National Transit Database, the sales tax is the second largest source of capital funds after federal funds, and the second largest source of operating funds after fares. Some providers rely solely on a sales tax. Others levy a sales tax in combination with other taxes. It is popular in part because part of the burden falls on commuters and visitors. It is paid in small increments, so the tax bite is less evident, and it is usually passed to support specific transit projects. Some examples of other regions that levy a sales tax in support of public transportation include Metro Transit in the Twin Cities region in Minnesota, the Regional Transit Authority in the Chicago region, the Metropolitan Atlanta Rapid Transit Authority, Greater Cleveland Regional Transit Authority, Sound Transit in Seattle, and LA Metro, among others. Many other regions also rely on multiple funding sources, including the Chicago area, which benefits from a regional funding model that includes funding from the state, the city, a 6-county region, and the Chicago Transit Authority. Tax-based sharing is also done in many urban regions. In the Twin Cities, they passed a law in 1971, now called the Fiscal Disparities Law, that requires nearly 200 local governments to share a portion of the property tax dollars generated by industrial and commercial growth in the metropolitan area. The program redistributes hundreds of millions of dollars per year and has reduced the gap between high and low income areas from about 12-to-1 to about 5-to-1. It has reduced competition among communities and eased the pressure to develop land better suited for recreation or open space. It does have critics among the wealthier communities that must share their tax base. As in the governance section of the report, we identified potential policy options that could provide more regional funding sources for public transportation in Michigan. First, we need more funding options than just the property tax, though the level of funding needed will likely require the support of one of the big 3 taxes, property, sales, or income. Property taxes are just not a good practical or political fit as a main source of funding for regional transportation. Any new taxes would require 1, state authorization through either a state law or constitutional amendment, if we're talking about a sales tax. 2, a resolution from the local government or transit board to levy the tax. And 3, voter approval. No new taxes can be levied without voter approval. Possibly the most important thing on this slide is the last bullet. Any new taxes will be most effective if levied at the regional level. This can be the county level or a regional authority. If taxes are levied at the local level, it reduces their administrative efficiency, decreases their equity and neutrality, increases local competition among communities, and intensifies socioeconomic disparities. One option we discuss in detail in the report is a local sales tax. Like all tax options, it will have advantages and disadvantages. A local sales tax is not currently allowed in Michigan. The Constitution restricts the tax rate to 6%. It is not clear if this restriction applies to local governments or just the state. If it applies to all taxing entities, then the state could not authorize a local sales tax without a constitutional amendment, which would require a statewide vote of the people. In addition to the rate restriction, the Constitution also restricts where sales tax revenues can go, mainly to the school aid fund and state revenue sharing. So a constitutional amendment would likely be required to allow a local sales tax to be levied in support of transit. One option in Michigan would be to expand the sales tax to services. Right now, it is levied mostly on goods. The tax base can be expanded through state law, but as we just said, changing the distribution so that sales tax revenues could be used to support transit would likely require a constitutional amendment. Another option is to levy an excise tax on specific goods or services. Some examples include sin taxes, like alcohol, tobacco taxes, or tourism-type taxes, taxes on hotels, car rentals. One area of services that is taxed in other states, but not in Michigan, is entertainment or amusement services. This includes things like tickets to sporting events or concerts, merchandise sold at these events, recreation activities like skiing, bowling. Some states and local units tax streaming services like Netflix. This would require legislative authorization at the state level, but not a constitutional amendment because it would not be a general sales tax. Another tax that we discuss in detail in the report is a local income tax. According to the National Transit Database, the income tax is not as common in support of transit as sales or property taxes. Like all taxes, it has advantages and disadvantages. Ohio and Oregon allow transit districts to levy a local income tax. Other states, Indiana for example, allow local governments to levy income taxes in support of transit service. In Michigan, the local sales tax is available to cities, and 24 cities currently levy one. The Constitution permits a graduated income tax, and state law sets the rate limits for cities. Probably the biggest negative associated with the current city income tax is that it is levied at the most local level, which can lead to competition among neighboring communities and economic distortions. This may be one reason why so few cities levy the tax. Authorizing an income tax at the county or regional level would eliminate some of these negative externalities. For example, it is not generally difficult for a business to locate in a neighboring community to avoid a local income tax, but it is more difficult for a business to leave a region. Traditional transportation taxes and fees have been used in Michigan and other states for years, and we discuss them in our report as well. New types of taxes and fees are being pursued across the U.S. and internationally. Their goals include curbing pollution and emissions from cars, as well as raising money for transportation. The big benefit to these types of taxes and fees is that they can constitute road user fees and have a direct connection to public transit, which helps to alleviate road use and congestion. However, we have seen little direct use of these types of fees to support transit due to the still dominant view that revenues from personal vehicle use should go to roads. They are also not viable as a primary source of revenue, but would represent supplemental revenue in support of transit. They are not used in Michigan and represent the changing nature of funding transportation. As far as traditional transportation taxes and fees, the state constitution restricts their revenues and directs most of the funding to roads. If local transportation taxes were expanded, allowing more than 10% of the proceeds to go to transit might require a constitutional amendment. Tax-based sharing is a very important part of any regional funding model. Public transportation goes beyond local political boundaries and is only possible with a regional model. The tables I showed you earlier illustrate the variance in taxable value per capita in Southeast Michigan and across the state and highlight the need for tax-based sharing. Why is this so important? Because improved regional transportation benefits the entire region through increased tourism, expanded regional and cross-county services, better connection to jobs and retail, decreased road congestion and wear, and improved public health. Tax-based sharing can be done with any kind of tax. The key is that the revenues are levied regionally and spent across the region to improve mobility. It can be politically challenging. The state can take a role by either requiring tax-based sharing or providing incentives for more regional support of public transportation. Feathering tax rates refers to levying higher taxes near the central city and lower taxes farther from the city. It can make taxes more palatable for communities farther from the urban center. This map is of Kalamazoo Metro, which levies one property tax across the county and another in the urban Kalamazoo area. This allows the entire county to fund some level of service, but does not make the out-county region pay a higher tax for urban services that don't benefit them directly. This is also done in the Chicago region. The residents of Chicago and Cook County pay higher sales tax rates in support of public transportation than residents in surrounding counties, and the residents of Chicago also pay a real estate transfer tax in support of transit service. Spreading the tax burden refers to levying multiple local taxes in support of public transportation so the burden does not fall so heavily on one type of tax, right now the property tax. Many urban transit providers across the U.S. levy multiple local taxes to fund transit service. One option for the RTA in Southeast Michigan would be to pursue a local property tax and vehicle registration fee along with support from constituent local governments. Or if local taxes were expanded, the RTA could could pursue combining a local property tax with a sales or income tax. One big problem when trying to expand transportation funding is that there is an outcry that more road funding is needed, which is true and was addressed in our last report, evaluating Michigan's options to increase road funding. A recent Senate Fiscal Agency report stated that we need $2.2 billion of funding per year for roads on top of the 2015 $1.2 billion increase. Everyone can agree that more road funding is needed, but some may point to our past choices of focusing most of our transportation projects and funding on concrete and roads as leading to more road lanes and miles to maintain. Changing our focus to multimodal transportation funding and moving people rather than cars might help to lessen the future burden of road infrastructure needs. In San Diego County, they passed a sales tax measure in 1987, which provided funding for transit expansion, highway expansion, and local street and roadway improvements. It was renewed in 2004 for 40 years. In San Diego, they have taken the viewpoint that roads and transit projects and funding should be complementary, not competitive. In Michigan, transportation projects and funding are separated between roads and transit, and road funding is prioritized. One option would be to combine road and transit funding in a complete streets funding policy. We would still be required to follow constitutional and statutory guidelines related to transportation funding. Combining transportation funding would require 1, road commissions and local governments to work with transit authorities when it comes to funding, a potentially difficult concept since they are often seen as competitors for the same funding, or 2, authority be given over both roads and transit to public authorities or regional governments. The important thing to remember is that roads and transit both need to be adequately funded. Projects that combine the two could benefit both. This last slide before our conclusion just touches back on the future of transportation and transit's role in this evolving landscape. Ride-sharing is likely to grow. It can threaten taxi service, but it can grow as a complement to transit. Autonomous vehicles will become more prevalent. They can be a service that grows out of ride-sharing to provide vehicles to serve the needs of many and connect people to transit. Mobility options will continue to expand, and people will demand multimodal transportation options. Public transportation can and should evolve with private transportation and be a complement to the sharing economy. In conclusion, effective regional transportation services are critical to urban revitalization in Detroit and across the state. Regional transportation systems of the future will include public and private options that are marketed together and paid for by the user with a single fee. They will be door-to-door and integrate walking, biking, and scootering with ride-sharing, car options, and public transportation. For a quick recap, to provide effective regional transportation, we need 1, to change the perception of transit from a social welfare program to a vital public utility. 2, regional governance over transportation and related policies. And 3, regional funding models that will likely include new funding options and tax-based sharing. No one right way exists to provide public transportation, but we know that it must be approached from a regional rather than a local perspective. And that is all I have today. Thank you, and I will pass it back to Jordan.
Thank you, Jill. We have received a few questions already, but I would like to remind you that there is still time if you have any other questions that have come up to ask them. So the first question comes on kind of the pairing between public and private transit. What value comes from focusing on integrating the two public and private transit options? And is there possibly too large of a focus, or what is the ideal level that public organizations should be focusing on integrating the two?
Okay, that was a good question. I don't know I don't have any numbers or ideas for what the ideal level of integration would be, but what I would say is if we, when my last slide talking about the future of transportation is evolving. Private transportation, ride sharing is growing. We're getting into autonomous vehicles. People want multimodal options, and they don't care if it's from the public or private sector. So if we want effective transportation options, we need to work. The public transportation model needs to evolve and work with the private model, adopt positive things from the private model, and collaborate with to provide people with what they want, which is more mobility. All I can say is, in my research, I came across one thing saying something from the saying in the 1800s that they thought the major transportation problem of the future was going to be removing horse manure from the streets. So I think the point is that we don't know what the future holds, but public transportation is going to continue to evolve, and public transportation and transit needs to be part of that.
Did you look at how to better connect urban and rural areas at all?
This research did not. Our focus, public transportation is such a big topic, and public transportation is such a big topic. So we started from looking at Southeast Michigan and what was going on with the RTA to look at how is transportation provided in urban areas in Michigan, and then what is done in other states that we could maybe learn from or replicate. So I know that transportation is provided in rural areas, more of a dial-a-ride type services, but lots of public transportation is provided across the state, and that may be a future topic of research to look at how they are connected and how public transportation needs can be met in rural areas, but this study is focused on urban areas.
Okay. Can feathered tax rates be done under current law? Is that legal the way that the RTAs are set up now and with state law?
I think that if we wanted to feather tax rates or levy different property taxes, like in the RTA region, I think the state law would probably need to be amended at this point. Clearly, it can be done in transit authorities. You have in Kalamazoo and in Flint transit authorities that are levying countywide taxes to provide the door-to-door demand response dial-a-ride type service, and then taxes in just the urban region to provide the fixed route bus service. So I think it can be done, but some state laws may need to be amended or otherwise changed.
All right. With that, we have no other outstanding questions. If you have had a question about today's material that we did not get to, or if you come up with anything else, please send us the question via email. Finally, I'd just like to remind you that you will receive an email soliciting feedback on today's webinar. We look forward to your comments. Thank you for joining us today, and have a good rest of your day.